tentatively including me in small conversations, updates about life. Moments that had previously been filtered through the lens of holidays and obligations. There was a subtle shift in tone, a softening that suggested curiosity rather than expectation. My son, usually brisk and matter-of-fact, lingered a little longer on the phone, asking questions about my plans, seemingly trying to understand, even if imperfectly. My grandchildren, blissfully unaware of the intricacies of adult negotiation, simply noticed that I was lighter, freer, smiling more easily than I had in years. I also began small acts of reclamation within the house itself. I rearranged furniture in ways I had long desired but never attempted. I bought fresh flowers for the kitchen table, something I had never indulged in before, considering it frivolous when there were pies to be baked and chairs to be dragged. I experimented with new recipes, not traditional ones, not the ones tied to expectation, but new combinations of flavors, dishes I had been curious about but never dared to try. Cooking, once a duty, became an expression of joy. Preparing a simple risotto, or a fragrant stew, or a dessert that involved chocolate in ways my mother would have raised an eyebrow at, became a celebration of self. A testament to the fact that the act of creation could belong entirely to me. Evenings were spent in reflection. Sometimes with a glass of wine, sometimes in the quiet company of my own thoughts. I wrote lists of destinations I wanted to see, books I wanted to read, classes I might take. I allowed myself to ponder hobbies I had abandoned, skills I had never learned. I imagined journaling in cafes in foreign cities, sketching in quiet gardens, photographing sunsets, collecting moments instead of just memories of routines. I realized that for decades, I had deferred joy, postponing curiosity and exploration for the sake of duty. Now, there were no postponements. Only the present, and the vast horizon beyond it, and yet, as I moved into this new space of independence, I could not entirely ignore the echoes of the past. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays, anniversaries, they remained markers of time, reminders of what had been, and what might have been. I thought of Aunt Carol, the polished house, the laughter and clinking of glasses I had watched from afar. I recognized a pang of envy, but it was tempered by understanding. She had always chosen her own way, just as I was now choosing mine. The difference was that now, I acknowledged my own right to do the same. I started reaching out, small gestures at first. I sent a text to my daughter, sharing a recipe I had experimented with, a brief note about how it had turned out. I called my son to ask for advice on a travel itinerary, discovering that his usually brisk voice carried a warmth I hadn't noticed before. I laughed more freely with my grandchildren when they visited, allowing the room to fill with noise and spontaneity, not dictated by expectation, but by the joy of presence. And yet, the true liberation came when I imagined stepping onto a plane, suitcase in hand, leaving behind the rituals that had defined me. The idea of being somewhere entirely new, without obligation, without precedent, without comparison, filled me with a sense of exhilaration I had not experienced since I was a child. I pictured the first morning of that trip, the gentle sunlight spilling over unfamiliar landscapes, the air tinged with foreign scents, the sounds of a city waking without me having to orchestrate anything. I imagined walking streets I had never walked, tasting food I had never tasted, meeting people whose lives were utterly different from mine. And I realized, with a quiet shock, that the world was larger than I had allowed myself to imagine. That the scope of possibility had been confined only by my adherence to routine and tradition. In this space, I also began to reflect on the nature of family. The realization came gently, almost imperceptibly, that families do not always intend harm, and yet change in ways that can feel hurtful. Priorities shift, routines evolve, and what was once central can drift to the periphery without malice. My children, my grandchildren, my sister, they had not set out to replace me, nor to diminish my role. They had simply moved forward in ways I had not yet allowed myself to consider. And in that understanding, I found compassion, not just for them, but for myself. I could release the bitterness I had felt, replace it with gratitude for the years spent in love and service, and still embrace a future that belonged entirely to me. As the days passed, I began documenting my journey. Not for anyone else, not as proof, but as a chronicle of self-discovery. I wrote of my memories, my plans, my fears, and my small victories. I recorded recipes, thoughts on books, ideas for art and travel. I reflected on the patterns of my life, the invisible rules I had adhered to, and the new ones I could create. And in that documentation, I found clarity, that life is not merely a series of obligations, but a series of choices. That every decision to honor oneself is a reaffirmation of existence, of value, of the right to joy. By the time December rolled around, I had booked my flights, arranged my accommodations, and packed my bag with a sense of purpose I had not felt in decades. I had learned to negotiate with my own heart, balancing excitement with trepidation, anticipation with respect for the life I was temporarily leaving behind. And in doing so, I discovered a profound truth: the act of stepping away, even briefly, does not diminish love. It enhances it, for absence, when chosen consciously and thoughtfully, can illuminate presence in ways proximity sometimes cannot. The day of my departure arrived with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy. I woke early, before the sun had fully risen, the sky a pale wash of pink and gold, the kind of quiet moment that always promised possibility. My suitcase sat by the door, neatly packed, yet somehow heavy, not with clothes, but with decades of unspoken emotions, traditions, expectations, and the subtle ache of leaving behind what had defined me. I moved through the house one last time, taking in the familiar sights and sounds with a sense of reverence. The kitchen counters, worn from years of baking, gleamed under the morning light. My mother's recipe cards, carefully stored in a tin that had survived generations, lay neatly on the shelf. The dining table, scarred with tiny dents and scratches, seemed to acknowledge my presence, as if it understood that this moment was more than a simple departure, it was a reclaiming. I paused in the living room, brushing my fingers lightly over the spines of old photo albums. Remembering Thanksgivings past, my children toddling across the floor, my husband laughing over burnt pies, the scent of roasted turkey lingering in the air like a familiar song. There was a flutter of guilt, as always, when I considered my family. My daughter, who had called me 2 weeks before Thanksgiving with such tentative care, must be thinking of me now. My son, practical and straightforward, likely wrestling with the implications of my absence. My grandchildren, blissfully unaware of the emotional layers at play, would notice the missing laughter, the missing stories, the missing hands guiding the table settings and the holiday rituals. But I reminded myself gently, firmly, this was not abandonment. This was survival. This was honoring the self I had deferred for far too long. The drive to the airport was filled with a strange, exhilarating quiet. I listened to music I had not allowed myself to hear in years, songs that spoke of freedom, exploration, and possibility. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a sense of ownership, not just of the car, but of my life. I marveled at the crisp winter air. The way it filled my lungs, sharp and invigorating, reminding me that every breath was a gift, and that every moment I had spent deferring my own desires had been a choice I could now reverse. At the airport, I moved with a purpose I had not felt in decades. Checking in, passing through security, walking toward the gate, I felt a curious mixture of vulnerability and power. Vulnerable because I was stepping into the unknown, leaving the familiar warmth of home and family behind. Powerful because I was claiming a space that had always been denied to me. The space of self-determination, of intentional experience, of choosing joy on my own terms. Of boarding the plane, I settled into my seat and allowed myself to exhale in a way I hadn't realized I had been holding my breath for years. The seatbelt clicked snugly around my waist, the hum of the engines beneath me a steady, reassuring vibration. I gazed out the window as the world below receded, the towns and highways shrinking into a tapestry of memory, until the horizon swallowed it all. And in that moment, I understood fully, this journey was not just about a destination. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my life, stepping out. Meanwhile, back home, my family began to grapple with the implications of my absence. My daughter, who had so carefully suggested Aunt Carol's house for Thanksgiving, realized the subtle impact of her words. My son, practical and logical as always, began to see the courage it took for me to step away, to prioritize myself after decades of devotion. My grandchildren, in their simple, pure way, noticed the gap, the absence, the space that only I could fill. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the dynamics shifted. Conversations began to include questions about my trip, curiosity about the places I would see, stories I might gather. The absence I had feared became a bridge, a subtle invitation for them to engage with me in new ways. To appreciate the person I had been beyond the roles I had played. On the plane, I opened my journal for the first time in months. Writing not out of obligation, but out of sheer desire. I chronicled the sensation of departure, the taste of freedom, the quiet thrill of autonomy. I wrote about the leaves I had seen falling that first morning, the sunlight that had kissed the counters of my kitchen, the photographs that had simultaneously wounded and awakened me. I wrote about the understanding I had reached, that love, while constant, does not require self-erasure. That traditions, while meaningful, must be flexible enough to honor the individuals within them. That sometimes, the act of stepping away, of choosing oneself, is the most profound gift one can give, to oneself and, ultimately, to others. As the plane ascended, I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the vibration of the engines, the gentle pressure of altitude, and the soft hum of fellow travelers remind me that life was alive with possibilities I had yet to explore. I imagined the warmth of a distant sun on my skin, the taste of unfamiliar foods, the laughter of strangers in languages I had yet to understand. I imagined walking streets that were not mine, but in which I could find pieces of myself, moments of discovery, sparks of joy. And for the first time in decades, I felt fully, completely untethered. In the following days, as the plane carried me further from home, I discovered a rhythm I had not known existed. Mornings were mine to fill with coffee, reflection, and quiet observation. Afternoons were spent wandering markets, exploring alleys, discovering hidden corners of cities that thrummed with life I had only ever observed from afar. Evenings were filled with the gentle satisfaction of choosing my own experiences, without compromise, without obligation, without comparison. Every sensation, sound, scent, taste, texture, was magnified by the awareness that this was my time, my choice, my life in motion, and in the distance, I imagined my family back home. I knew they were adjusting, slowly learning to navigate a holiday season without my orchestrated presence. Perhaps they were learning, finally, to appreciate not just the traditions I maintained, but the person I had always been beyond those rituals. Perhaps they were realizing, quietly, that the love that had sustained our family for decades was not diminished by absence, but reinforced by the courage to prioritize oneself. By the time the first week of my journey passed, I had begun to internalize a profound shift. No longer was I defined solely by my role as the keeper of tradition, the architect of holidays, the silent laborer behind every festive memory. I was defined by choice, by curiosity, by the willingness to step into the unknown and embrace life in its full, unfiltered glory. The freedom I felt was not reckless, nor was it selfish. It was deliberate, intentional, sacred. It was a recognition that decades of devotion had been valuable. But that devotion to oneself was equally vital, and as the plane touched down in a sunlit city I had only ever imagined, I felt a sense of arrival unlike any I had known before. This was more than a destination. It was a threshold. Beyond it lay experiences I could not yet fully predict, adventures that would challenge me, delight me, teach me, and remind me that life is meant to be lived expansively, not merely endured. In that moment, I understood that the act of letting go, of stepping away from traditions that no longer served me, was the act that had finally set me free. The first days of my journey were a gentle awakening. I wandered streets lined with sun-dappled buildings, each corner brimming with unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells that delighted my senses. I marveled at the vibrancy of life around me, the laughter of children chasing each other across cobblestone squares, the scent of fresh bread wafting from small bakeries, the rhythmic clatter of trams passing through bustling avenues. Every detail was amplified by the realization that I had chosen this life, even if only for a while, even if only for myself. The freedom I had felt on the plane had not been fleeting. It was the foundation of a transformation I had long deferred. I explored local markets, touching fabrics I had never seen before, tasting fruits and spices that seemed to dance on my tongue, and chatting with shopkeepers whose language was different but whose warmth was universal. I found joy in the simplicity of curiosity, asking questions, discovering answers, laughing at my own mispronunciations, delighting in the small victories of communication. For the first time in decades, I was learning not from routine or obligation, but from the sheer pleasure of living. Nights were particularly transformative. Sitting on balconies that overlooked sparkling cityscapes, I watched the sun dip below unfamiliar horizons and felt the quiet thrill of possibility settle into my bones. I journaled by the soft glow of lamplight, documenting not just the places I had seen, but the emotions I had unearthed, the quiet satisfaction of independence, the courage that had carried me across oceans and streets unknown, and the gentle pride in recognizing that I had finally chosen myself. I realized, with every line written, that the act of stepping away had not been an act of rebellion, but an act of reclamation. As the days passed, I also found a deeper connection to my memories back home. I remembered the Thanksgivings, Christmases, and birthdays I had hosted, and I felt no bitterness. Instead, there was gratitude for the laughter, the chaos, the love, and the lessons those years had given me. I understood that traditions were meaningful, but not sacrosanct. They could evolve, shift, or even end, without diminishing the value of what had come before. I could honor my past while creating a new path for the future. I also reflected on my family's reactions to my choice. I imagined my daughter, perhaps realizing the courage it took for me to step away, and feeling a mix of surprise, admiration, and maybe even guilt for assuming I would always remain in the background. I imagined my son, understanding more fully that independence does not equate to abandonment, that love can be expressed through freedom and choice as much as through presence and service. I imagined my grandchildren, recognizing that holidays could be joyful even without the same routines, that the essence of family is not fixed, and each thought reminded me that absence, when chosen deliberately, does not diminish love, it illuminates it. My absence had allowed my family to reflect, to adjust, and to see me not merely as the caretaker of tradition, but as a full, autonomous person. And in seeing myself clearly, they too could begin to appreciate the depth of what I had given. Not with resentment or expectation, but with generosity and intention. By midweek, I had taken small excursions into surrounding towns, walking along sunlit promenades and winding paths that seemed designed for reflection. I tasted local delicacies in cafes tucked down narrow streets, discovering flavors that had been foreign, surprising, and utterly delightful. I took photographs, not for anyone else, not for social media, not for validation, but as a testament to the beauty of moments fully experienced. Each click of the shutter was an acknowledgement of presence, a small declaration that I existed outside the confines of expectation and tradition. That I also began to engage with the locals, listening to stories of their lives, their families, their own traditions. I realized how universal certain themes were: devotion, duty, love, expectation, and the subtle tension between obligation and desire. I shared my own story, in fragments, with those who asked, and discovered that vulnerability, even with strangers, could be liberating. My story, once confined to the quiet corners of my kitchen, now traveled with me, shaping and reshaping itself with every new encounter. One evening, as I walked along a beach under a sky painted with the deep reds and oranges of sunset, I reflected on the journey that had led me here. I thought about my mother, whose hands had guided mine in kitchens long past, whose wisdom had been imparted not just in words, but in the very act of preparing a meal with care and love. I thought about my sister, Aunt Carol, and the unspoken rivalry, admiration, and comparison that had colored our lives. I thought about my children, my grandchildren, and the delicate balance of love and independence. And I understood, fully and completely, that the courage to step into my own life did not diminish the love I had for them. It enhanced it, giving it space to breathe and evolve. The final day of my trip arrived with a bittersweet sweetness. I packed my bags slowly, savoring the memories I had created, the sensations I had experienced, the quiet empowerment that now pulsed steadily in my chest. I boarded the plane back home with a sense of completion, not of ending, but of transformation. I carried with me a new understanding, that life is not a series of obligations to be endured, but a series of choices to be made with intention, courage, and love. Returning home, I found that the landscape had not changed, but I had. The house, familiar and worn, greeted me with quiet acceptance. The furniture, the counters, the photo albums, all remained, unchanged, yet somehow lighter, as if they too had recognized my transformation. I began to re-engage with family, not in the roles I had once inhabited, but as the full person I had discovered. Conversations were different, richer, deeper. The children laughed, not just at the familiar routines, but at the stories I brought back, the experiences I shared, the joy I had claimed for myself. And in the quiet moments, I realized that the holidays, the traditions, the family gatherings, they remained meaningful, but no longer defined me. I had discovered a freedom deeper than any celebration, a liberation that came from honoring myself, from stepping away and returning with new perspective, from embracing both the past and the future with dignity, grace, and joy. For the first time in decades, I understood the true power of choice. The holidays that once confined me had become a backdrop, a canvas upon which I could paint my own story. I had discovered that love, family, and tradition could coexist with independence, curiosity, and personal fulfillment. And in that discovery, I felt a profound, unshakable peace, a knowledge that I had finally leveled up, not in comparison to others, but in alignment with myself. This year, and all the years that followed, the holidays would be different. They would be richer, freer, more deliberate. And for the first time, they would belong fully to me, not because I had chosen to exclude others, but because I had chosen to include myself.